Thank you so much, Callie. And thank you to all of you for coming back today. I'm so sorry, but I would just think that CSP's staff are the most brilliant people, not only for rescheduling so completely, but for what which they did so. So I had myself all set up last Thursday. I'm actually curating an art exhibition at the moment, and it's in the City of London. In fact, it's about two streets away from the area I'm going to be talking about tonight, and where Shakespeare's very original theatre was. So I was like, I'm going to teach from the gallery. It's going to be really atmospheric. It's going to be perfect. And someone brought in a bunch of flowers to say thank you to my co-curator. And the water, it was a lovely gesture. And then they tipped the vase and the water went all over my computer. So as Callie and Arie wrote, it was a comedy of errors. I was thinking it was a Jacobean tragedy, but actually they reframed it for me. So I'm very glad to be back here tonight with all of you, but I'm afraid I'm not in such an exciting venue. I'm just teaching from home tonight. But that gives me a way in because that comedy of errors versus Jacobean tragedy, you know, that can often be said about the same play. We think that Shakespeare writes comedy and writes tragedy, but he does so in the technical definition. Comedy is where people end up married at the end. Tragedy is when people end up dead at the end. So technically, The Merchant of Venice is a comedy. You know, if you're looking through it through an Elizabethan lens, if you're looking at it through a strictly literature academic lens, it's a comedy. If you're looking at it through a Jewish lens, um, it doesn't end in death, but in some ways it might as well do. I would very much read it as a tragedy. And that, on the one hand, on the other hand, we know is such a Jewish way of thinking. And it's all about shifting perspective. I think Jewish reading is not necessarily about what you read, but about how you read, about asking the questions. You know, that's what Talmudic exploration is all about. That's what all those rabbis like Rashi who read into the white space of biblical text do. It's asking the questions and shifting the perspective through which we see something. So that's what I want to do tonight. As you heard from Callie's very generous introduction of me, I am a literature academic. I have a PhD in English literature, but really my career has been twofold. It's been partly in the museum and heritage world, and it's been partly as a publisher. So I'm coming at this from a slightly different place. I've come to my love of Shakespeare and fascination with Shakespeare and the Jews, as I mentioned, originally through working on an exhibition, but also through teaching Jewish literature and saying, is this something we can count as Jewish literature? So today is it's my geographical session, but in many ways it's also my historical session. I'm going to give you some of the historical context around The Merchant of Venice being written. Next week we're going to move on to other things, but I'm going to look at it. You know, none of the sources, the original sources I'm presenting it, are my own discovered research. And I will always credit the academics who did do that really in-depth archival research as we go. But what I'm trying to do is say, what happens if we shift perspective and look at the same material through a Jewish lens? Is there a way to tell a different story? So that's kind of what we're doing tonight. We're doing a little bit of this is the way things are usually told, but what about if we just shift that lens over a little bit? And in doing so, I'm kind of going to fall between two perspectives because, as I introduced with you last week, there are people who say it's a terrible Merchant of Venice is a terribly anti-Semitic play, including some of the people who I'm going to use tonight on crypto Jewish life in London. But there are also people who just go so far to the other extreme. I mean, there's one academic who goes, Shakespeare's grandfather was actually not Shakespeare but Shapiro, and that family themselves were crypto Jews. And I love it. It's a very interesting theory, but there's absolutely no hard evidence at all. So I think the truth, or maybe the narrative that I'm going to try and tell tonight, is somewhere in between. Is neither Shakespeare was a fierce anti-Semite, nor he was a crypto Jew. It's that he was living in a London where he was surrounded by Jews. And I think that living in London is key. Not just living in London, living in the city of London. So I'm actually going to start where I left off last week and take one step back in order to go forward. So let me share my screen. Okay. So last week I left you with the speech from the play about Sir Thomas More that it's believed Shakespeare wrote. And I'm going to play it for you one more time so that it's fresh in our minds, because it was a long time ago we heard it. So let's hear it once more.
In the British Library is a manuscript of a play about Henry VIII's Chancellor, Sir Thomas More. It's partly in Shakespeare's own handwriting. And this is the extraordinary speech he wrote as Thomas More quelled a race riot in the City of London on May Day, appealing to the mob to consider the plight of the foreign immigrants.
The strangers should be removed! Grant them removed! And grant that this your noise hath kicked down all the majesty of England. Imagine that you see the wretched strangers, their babies at their backs, with their poor luggage plodding to the ports and coasts for transportation, and that you sit as kings in your desires, authority quite silenced by your brawl, and you, in ruff of your opinions, clothed. What have you got? I'll tell you, you had taught how insolence and strong hand should prevail, how order should be quelled, and by this pattern not one of you should live an aged man, for other ruffians, as their fancies wrought, with self-same hand, self-reason, and self-right, would shark on you, and men like ravenous fishes feed on one another. You'll put down strangers, kill them, cut their throats, possess their houses, and lead the majesty of law in Liam to slip him like a hound. Oh, desperate as you are, wash your foul minds with tears, and those same hands that you like rebels lift against the peace, lift up for peace, and your unreverent knees make them your feet to kneel, to be forgiven. Say now, the king, as he is clement, if the offender mourn, should so much come too short of your great trespass as but to banish you. Whither would you go? What country, by the nature of your error, should give you harbour? Go you to France, or Flanders, to any German province, Spain, or Portugal, and anywhere that not adheres to England? Why, you must needs be strangers. Would you be pleased to find a nation of such barbarous temper that breaking out in hideous violence would not afford you an abode on earth? Whet their detested knives against your throats, spurn you like dogs, and like as if that God owned not, nor made not you, nor that the elements were not all appropriate to your comfort, but chartered unto them. What would you think to be thus used? This is the stranger's case. And this, your mountainish inhumanity.
So thank you, Sir Ian McKellen, for reading it so beautifully. I just want to contextualize it and explain what that speech is. So the play is about the life of Sir Thomas More. And at this point, Thomas More, the hero, is the Sheriff of London. And he is pleading with the crowd to accept and welcome those in their midst who are seeking asylum, who are seeking a safe haven. And what he says is, you know, imagine, you know, you're looking at these wretched strangers, these people who have nothing, who need help. You are the kings here, you know, what you are ruling here, okay? Because your brawl, your race riots have silenced authority. You, as the people, are making the decision what will happen to these poor strangers because you are causing such havoc that the king, at that point we're talking Henry VIII, will do whatever you tell him. And More says to the rioters, think about it. If you were refugees, if England couldn't have you, if you were refugees, where would you go? And if you went somewhere, if you went to Spain or Portugal, note those two names, or he gives other examples, Flanders, Germany, etc. He said, well, how would you feel if this is how you were greeted? You know, you were the strangers and you found no abode on earth. You were greeted with detested knives against your throats, spurned like dogs. Okay. And what happens is Thomas More convinces the mob of race rioters, to back down. And this is absolutely the high point of the play. In the way I would say Shakespeare's "If you prick me, do not, if you prick us, do we not bleed," is the emotional crux of the Merchant of Venice. Okay. So let's just take the language. I want to unpick in a minute the historical references, but let's just take the language. Last week I talked about how Shakespeare uses verbs, nouns as verbs, and that's one of the reasons it's been identified as hymn writing. But one of the others is use of phrases that appear in other of his plays or sonnets. And here is a key one. How would you feel, you Englishmen, if you became a refugee and the people in the homeland where you were trying to seek refuge spurned you like dogs? Where was that phrase from? I think we all know. Act 1, Scene 3, Merchant of Venice. Because what does Shylock say to Antonio? You call me cutthroat dog. You spurned me such a day. And Antonio says to him, I'm likely to do so again, to spit on thee again, to spurn thee too. It's so clearly the language is referential. So first of all, let's just put a note to ourselves that here we have a play of The Merchant of Venice where the Jewish refugees are being spurned like dogs. A few years later, Shakespeare writes a speech in another play where he says to Englishmen, what on earth are you doing? Like treating strangers like this, spurning them like dogs. Okay. Would you like this to be done to you, you English Christians? Okay. So obviously, I know for all of us, we hear an echo of a Jewish refugee narrative. And that is there too. And that one I will come back to. But I want to step back for a moment because it might be something we hear, but it's not what most literary historians hear. Okay. And this is what I mean about the Jewish vision. I'm immediately pulled by that spurned language and go Merchant of Venice. But actually, what the majority of literary historians who've written on this in the last 10 years do is something different. Okay. So they look at when the scene is taking place. And the scene is set during the May Day riots of 1517. So we're talking Italian immigrants from Lombardy are being threatened by Londoners. I mean, don't we all know this rhetoric, who accused them of taking jobs and money from the locals and wanted them to be deported back where they'd come from? But it's set about Italian refugees. But what almost every literary historian who's been writing about it says is actually Shakespeare, and we're talking 1600, 1604-ish. I'll come back to those dates. You know, it's not been dated exactly, but we're roughly around there somewhere. Okay. The big conflict of Shakespeare's time is not about those Italian refugees, but there is a massive fuss going on in London about Huguenot migrants. So the Huguenots have come over from French. There was a big massacre of them in France in 1572. So between 1572 and 1600, which is probably the earliest date this might have been written, thousands and thousands have fled to London. And London now, when we think London, we think a big city of millions. As I'm going to show you quite physically, London then is a small city. So this overwhelming influx of Huguenot refugees and Huguenot migrants gets this massive pushback. So there are race riots happening in Shakespeare's day too. So your average, or not average, but the mainstream historical perspective on this is that sure, Shakespeare is writing Sir Thomas More talking about the Italian refugees, but actually what Shakespeare is responding to is the Huguenot refugees of his day. So then the question goes, why does Shakespeare care? Why is he taking the Huguenot side? And to understand the answer, we have to know where Shakespeare lived at the time he's probably writing this. So here he is, and here is a blue plaque. This is the only time in Shakespeare's life in London we have an exact address for him, or as exact as it goes. The buildings have been knocked down, but we know it's at the corner of Silver Street near Noble Street. You know, we know roughly the block that he's living in. Okay, so this is where you find the blue plaque in the City of London saying this is where Shakespeare lived. So how do we know this? We know this because of a court case. Again, let me take a step back first. So by this point, Shakespeare is not only a successful actor and playwright, but he's leading the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which become the King's Men. It's the most prestigious theatre group in London. And he and his fellow players, when it was still the Lord Chamberlain's Men under Elizabeth I, did something very smart. So he, Richard Burbage, who I mentioned last week when I was talking about the paintings, Hemmings and Condell, two of the actors in his troupe who would go on to combine all the plays into the first folio, the authoritative edition of Shakespeare's plays that we go by now. They decided to take stock options. So they created a corporation essentially out of the theatre group. Rather than being dependent on salaries, they took the box office and split it between them and invested it. So actually what we know is pretty much every other actor in Shakespeare's troupe earned a lot of money and bought a substantial home in London. Most of them not in the city of London, but over on the South Bank or maybe slightly more towards the west, where it was richer, they were big houses, there was much more air. Shakespeare never did that. The place he bought and he sent money back was Stratford-upon-Avon, where his parents were, where his wife and children were. When Shakespeare was in London, as far as we know, he only ever rented. And we do have very, very good legal archives from that time, which is how we know who owned homes. So we don't know exactly where Shakespeare rented. Had he bought, we would be able to identify where he lived very clearly. But because he rented, we often know the vicinity of where he is through other kinds of legal records. I'll come to that in a moment. We know in 1604 he is lodging at this house because he was involved in a court case as a witness. It's one of the places you get Shakespeare's signature, which is how we recognise his handwriting, because he gives a witness statement. But he also has to give his address, and his address is key. Can you see here? He's at the house of Christopher and Mary Mountjoy. So Christopher and Mary Mountjoy are both people who are working in the theatrical world as costumers. Mary Mountjoy, and in fact her daughter Marie, are costume designers. They make dresses of all kinds, but we think they particularly made theatrical costumes. And the father, Christopher, made ladies' ornamental headpieces and wigs. He made them for society ladies too, but he also made them for the theatre. Makes complete sense, right? That this is where Shakespeare is lodging. He's lodging with other people in the theatre. So that plaque I showed you, I actually walked from there to, well, to a few of Shakespeare's theatres. He starts off in what's very simply called the Theatre in Shoreditch. The Lord Chamberlain's men then move a few steps kind of across the road to a small theatre called the Curtain Theatre. There's a big financial dispute. At the dead of night, they kind of sneak into the theatre, which was across the road, strip down the wood, take it across the river, and that's what they build the Globe from. Okay. But the Globe too is only about 15-20 minutes away because you can walk over London Bridge there. It's an easy walk, or you can take a boat across the river. So this is a very convenient location. There he is, living with Mary and Christopher Mountjoy. Mary and Christopher Mountjoy have a daughter, also Mary, but spelled Marie. So I'm going to call her Marie for now, just to differentiate. And Marie falls in love with Stephen Bellet, who's a Huguenot. The parents agree that they will marry. Marie, the daughter, had been promised a dowry. And because she marries a Huguenot, they don't give the dowry. So there's this whole court case that ensues. Shakespeare's a material witness. He signs the deposition of evidence. Lots of the other witnesses say, actually, Shakespeare's speaking kind of on behalf of the parents, but hang on a minute, because it was Shakespeare who arranged the betrothal. So who knew Shakespeare was a yenta? But he was. He was a real Shadchan, and he had introduced Marie and Stephen. So we have all this evidence about him living in this house at the corner of Silver and Monkwell Street in Cripplegate. But we also have all this evidence because the whole thing becomes a whole legal mess. And what we know is that actually it ends up getting remanded to the London Huguenot Church. So we know he's living surrounded by Huguenots. So what do all the historians do? They say, of course this speech that he writes Thomas More is giving isn't really about 1517 and the Italian immigrants. It's really about the contemporary times and the Huguenot immigrants, because Shakespeare knows Huguenots. This is why he empathizes. This is why he says, think about how you want to be treated. They are humans too. Okay. Now, there are different ways then to look at this. We could make a case, and I'll get to that kind of case, that it's not only the Huguenots, but also Jewish refugees he has in mind, and that they're spurned like dogs, echoing from The Merchant of Venice is no coincidence. But even if you don't go that far, with a Jewish lens, my next question will be, well, if he writes with sympathy to the Huguenots because he knows Huguenots, if we do say that his depiction of Shylock is to an extent sympathetic, or at least less anti-Semitic, and again, I'll come back to that, could it have been because he knew Jews? So it's very interesting if we look at where he lived when The Merchant of Venice was written. We want to go back a few years, okay? So if you are here, this is where the Noble Street house, the Mountjoy house, where he is. I don't know if you can see the archway. If you go there, there's a big road, and I'm going to show you a contemporary map that takes you to, oh, actually, I'll show you the contemporary map in a minute, but there is a big road there that takes you to where Shakespeare was living when he wrote The Merchant of Venice. They are again five, maybe, I don't think even 10 minutes walk away. Okay. And the road you go down to make that journey is called the London Wall. So I'm going to show you where we think he was living. And then if I'm right, I've put the map in, I'll show you the journey. Okay. So when he first arrives in London, things aren't as clear. We don't have the court case like we do 1604 to tell us exactly where he's living. We know he's arrived in London by 1592. We think he actually might have come slightly earlier, but we know he's arrived then because Robert Greene calls him Upstart Crow. I don't know if any of you have seen any of the kind of humorous series that play on this, but he's basically a young up and comer stealing all the limelight. We know he's in London then, but there's no address. We do get a mention of a London house by 1596. Why? Because between 1592 when he arrives and 1596, he's accrued money, he's accrued some wealth, he's used it to buy goods, probably at least books, but he hasn't paid any tax on it or tax on his goods. He's a tax evader. So in 1596, he appears on the parish records of St Helens in Bishopsgate saying this man lives in the parish and he hasn't paid his tax. You know, he needs to pay his tax or be fined. Actually, 1597, he appears again, records, he's still not paid any tax. He then, when they move the theatre across the South Bank and build the Globe, he temporarily moves to the South Bank. We get a record there going, yes, this man who lived in St Helens and now lived in our borough hasn't paid any of his tax and owes fines. So he comes back to the City of London. Okay. And that's when he moves in with Christopher and Mary Mountjoy. So, you know, I mentioned last time his father is a usurer. So Shakespeare is a tax evader. Does that make him more sympathetic with Shylock? I'm not sure. Jonathan Bate, a scholar I'm going to talk about in a minute, he's probably the most famous British Shakespearean scholar. I gave you all the Jewish American ones last week, but he's the big name in the British world. He says, he kind of goes, well, maybe that's why Shakespeare writes a speech about the quality of mercy, because at the time he's begging the authorities to have mercy on him and not fine him too much or throw him in prison. So we know anyway from the tax evasion records that in 1596, and obviously that date is key because that's when he starts working on Merchant of Venice, he's living in the parish of St Helens in Bishopsgate. So the City of London, the square mile, is under the Lord Mayor, but it's divided into parishes by church. He's living in the space governed by the church St Helens. You can see here is St Helens. That's the church he's living in. There's the churchyard. It's thought that he is living on Bishopsgate itself, somewhere in this area. Okay. So we don't know exactly where, but it makes sense. So this is St Helens Church. It still exists, and it's a very interesting church because it has a mechitza. Okay. So in a Jewish Orthodox synagogue, there's a boundary down the middle, or sometimes a gallery, but if it's all on the flat, it's divided between men and women. It's not quite St Helens. There's the same kind of separation down the middle, but on one side the nuns used to sit, and on the other side the commoners and the everyday people. So it had a convent within it. So in the nuns' side, there is this memorial to someone called William Bond. So William Bond was a very intrepid merchant adventurer. And in the plaque below, which is, by the way, written in Latin, and Shakespeare knew Latin because he went to a grammar school in Stratford-on-Avon. So there is a presumption if he went to church, this is a church he went to. By the way, that if is not me joking because, he got fined for avoiding taxes. His father was not only a usurer, his father got fined for non-attendance at church, which is partly why there is also this story about possibly, questioning were they Catholics, were they Jews? They were not like they were provisionally members of the Protestant church, but his father didn't go. Or it could be his father was just too embarrassed because everyone knew about his fall from grace. Shakespeare, we don't know. There are no records of finding him for not going. One presumes he went a little bit, or at least went enough to see this memorial. Why? So, this memorial to William Bond in Latin quotes a Greek epic poem, The Argonauts, because William Bond, the great intrepid adventurer merchant, is compared to Jason, as in Jason and the Argonauts, as in Jason and the Golden Fleece. William Bond's brother George is Lord Mayor of London during Shakespeare's early years there. He would have known who the family are. It's very likely he's living round the corner. This is where his parish is. It's very likely he would have seen it. This is an argument made by Jonathan Bate, okay? Why does Jonathan Bate go to all that trouble? Because the opening of Merchant of Venice starts with Bassano talking about Portia, okay? Nor is the wide world ignorant of her worth, for the four winds blow in from every coast renowned suitors, and her sunny locks hang on her temples like a golden fleece, okay? Which makes her the seat of Belmont's Colchos strand, and many Jasons come in quest of her, okay? So Jonathan Bate makes the case that Shakespeare is influenced by the things around him. He's living in St. Helens, that he sees this tribute and knows about William Bond, a merchant adventurer. And this is who Bassanio is based on. This is not, by the way, the only place in the play where Jason and the Argonauts and the Golden Fleece are cited. Okay. He also points out that across all of Shakespeare's writings, the word bond occurs only 73 times, and 39 of them, over half, appear in The Merchant of Venice. So he theorises that part of that play on the signing of the bond and what your bond means is Shakespeare having a little bit of fun with the story of the merchant adventurer, William Bond, the merchant of Venice. The merchant could be Bassanio, it could be Antonio. Again, why am I doing all this? Because what the people studying Thomas More say is that Shakespeare writes about the refugees because he knows Huguenot refugees he's living with him. Jonathan Bates says, you look at the text, there's these references to Jason and the Argonauts, there's a reference to Bond. Let's look where Shakespeare was living. Ah, this is what he would see, okay? So what Shakespeare sees around him is likely to influence him. So here's my little map. What is Shakespeare seeing around him when where he's living when he writes The Merchant of Venice? So this is where he ends up living, St. Helens Church, Bishopsgate. It's where his costumiers live, and he probably walked that route often. This is where he was living at the time. Sorry, this is where he's living at the time of writing Merchant of Venice. This is where the Mountjoys live, his costumiers, who he ends up moving in with later on. This is a route he likely walked very often, okay? Can you see the road is called London Wall? So what is London Wall? It's the remains of the Roman wall that first demarcated the city of London. So here are some of the Roman archaeological ruins. If any of you ever come to London, I will take you on a historical tour because it's not quite like Rome or Jerusalem where it's overt, because there was the Black Plague, the Great Fire of London, the bombing of the Blitz. You know, London went through a lot, so there are much fewer traces. But if you know where to look, you see the layers of the city. You see the Roman layers and you see the medieval layers. So the Roman wall first demarcated the city. That becomes the medieval demarcation of the city of London. And Shakespeare is a liminal creature. As a writer, he's liminal, he's on the thresholds, he's always inside and outside communities. But if where you look at where he lives and if you look at where his theatres are, they're all on the edges of the city of London. He's living just on the edge of what is city and what is not. And on the other side, his theatres are on the other edge. They're just outside the city walls. They're where the prostitutes are. They're where the gamblers are. They're where the ruffians are. This is before he moves to the Globe, although that's not a nice area either. But his theatres are outside the walls. He's living just outside the walls because he's an insider outsider. And that's why he's mixing with refugees. Now, I'm showing you these walls for another reason. They start as the Roman walls and they become the demarcation of the medieval city. So obviously I took this photo on the flat, but this one, I don't know if you can tell, I took from above. So where was I when I took it? Here. And this is exactly when I took it. I am on the walls of the Barbican. The Barbican, some of you might know, is a modern urban building in the City of London. It's a complex with music halls and theatres. It's now where the Royal Shakespeare plays in London. It's where the Guildhall School of Music is, huge numbers of apartments. It's a really urbanised centre built in the 1960s. Why am I, with a group of my subscribers to Jewish Renaissance, standing in the Barbican, looking over the corner of the medieval city? Because a project has just launched to investigate what is underneath the Barbican. Because Barbican is built, and you can see this is the Barbican estate in white. The blue square, which has a bit of an edge to it, is where the medieval Jewish cemetery was. So the Barbican is built on the edge of the medieval Jewish cemetery, which was literally just outside the wall of the City of London. Where did Shakespeare live? At different times, he lived at different edges of the Jewish cemetery. And you can see, stretching south below, Mountjoy House. Even one of the towers of the Barbican is named after the home where he was with the Mountjoys because it's that area. So this has been known about the existence of this medieval Jewish cemetery has been known for a long time. But this summer, a big project has been launched jointly between the British Library and several universities and people who work in the Tower of London. The estimation is there's at least 13,000 Jews who were buried there. Why did Jews who came into the city move to that area? Why is the earliest still existing synagogue, the oldest existing synagogue in London, in this area? Well, it goes all the way back to the medieval period. Jews who came under the readmission, and I'll talk about in a moment, moved into this area probably because it had always been the Jewish area. There's all sorts of other things. It's a whole other session looking at the history of this cemetery. It's fascinating. But Shakespeare is living on the edges of the cemetery. Now, by the time he's living there, the cemetery is disused, possibly to an extent turned over. But the likelihood he would have seen the grave cuttings, the likelihood he might have known some of the crypto Jews who moved back to that area is very, very high. Next week, I'm going to tell you about the crypto Jews or the new Christians, so Jews who had converted we know for sure he knew. And I'm going to give you all that evidence. But in my last kind of 15 minutes today, I want to take you through what happened because there is a history that goes Shakespeare couldn't have written with sympathy towards Jews. He didn't know any Jews. There were no Jews in the UK between 1219 and 1666. Not true. So let's do a little bit of a history lesson. Very quick one. So this is where he's living with the Mountjoys. And oh, I was going to show you this. Maybe I'll save this for next week. There's been a whole reimagining based on archaeological evidence of what London looked like, but I'll save that for next week when I might have a bit more time. What I want to do now is just go to the Jewish history. So this is your usual Jewish historical timeline. It's the one the Jewish Museum in London used. You know, this is the standard one. 1066, William the Conqueror brings the Jews into England. Things get difficult. 1275, Edward orders the Jews to wear a yellow patch. You know, these are the origins, by the way, of the yellow star, go right back to medieval England. 1290, the Jews are expelled. We've got the Inquisition here. 17th century, 1655, Manasseh ben Israel comes from Amsterdam, asks Oliver Cromwell to allow the return of the Jews to England, and around 1656 they're readmitted. By the way, not entirely Jew, because he does petition for a readmission, but the readmission's never actually granted. But what I want to just do for a moment is look at this story, because there is another moment, which is there are settled hidden Jews. So that moment of readmission is not just Jews coming to England from Amsterdam, France, Germany, but it's settled crypto Jews who've been living in England who come out of the woodwork. How do we know? Well, when Manasseh ben Israel arrives, who does he stay with? He stays with Antonio de Oliveira, who is probably a Portuguese crypto Jew. Why has it been disputed? Because there are no Jews in London in this period. You trace back his history, he is almost definitely a Portuguese crypto Jew. To show you the hoops historians tread through because they don't understand that converted Jews, new Christians are still leading a Jewish life, it's hilarious. So 1655, a newspaper reports that Jews have been seen meeting in Hackney on a Saturday. Here is the newspaper article. I've put it into type so you can read it despite the long essays. They're all very clean and neat. They're in a corner of a garden by a house, all of them with faces towards the east, their minister foremost and the rest all behind him. This reads like a Shabbat service to me, doesn't it? This can't be true. This has been disputed. There are no practicing Jews in England at this time, because this is before Manasseh ben Israel arrives. If we look back, and here is the medieval historian, the early modern historian, Jewish historian who's done the work, Ariel Hession, we know how many Jews there are. There are 6 Jews who immediately return after Edward I dies. By the way, they're led by someone who's either a rabbi or the doctor. That's very interesting. There are lots of doctors in this. We know Jews secretly re-establish themselves. There's 13th century manuscripts which have them in. We know that there is a building called the Domus Conversorum, the home of the converts in London, another one built in Oxford. By 1308, there are still over 50 converted Jews living in the building. 1356, the last one in London dies. So we're at least a century beyond this, there are no Jews. Crypto Jew, converted Jews, but they're all living together, marrying between each other, keeping the rituals. Here's the building in Oxford. We know John of Bristol, a quote-unquote converted Jew or crypto Jew, taught Hebrew in Oxford. We know that 1325, a Jew named Hagen is baptized as an adult, and he becomes chaplain of the converted Jew's home. Whether or not he's a Christian or Jewish chaplain is debatable. We know there are Lancashire deeds all the way through that were witnessed by John Le Due, Hugh Le Due, and Thomas Le Due. Okay. If I go on, you might know who Richard Whittington is. Okay. Here's an engraving which in the 19th century they took the skull out and replaced with a cat. Richard Whittington or Dick Whittington. Okay. Twice former Lord Mayor of London, 1510 to 1520s, he's Lord Mayor of London. Here he is on his deathbed, and there is a physician examining a bottle of urine. Okay. Who is his physician? A Jewish physician that he's brought from France first to attend his sick wife. Did you know Dick Whittington had a Jewish doctor? Okay. We know Henry the Fourth brought a Jewish doctor over from Bologna. We've got the documents. We know that Henry the Fourth naturalises another doctor a little bit later, who's then made Warden of the Royal Mint. There's an Italian apothecary named Job and his son John. They're Jewish. They're only naturalised after they are baptised, but they look like they live a crypto-Jewish life. There's very interesting things that continue happening all the way up to Shakespeare's time. So 1536, Portugal, who've been living in limbo, they've been allowing new Christians, Jews who are converted and living as Christians, but are really living Jewish lives, but nominally converted. Portugal has allowed them because Portugal saw what happened in Spain, and with the expulsion, what hit the economy took. So Portugal is much more fluid. It doesn't make things easy. But in 1536, Pope Paul eventually goes, you've got to have an Inquisition in Portugal, all these new Christians out. What happens is that same year, new Christians are granted permission to settle in the Netherlands. So we get lots of Jews going from Portugal to Amsterdam or Antwerp. Where do they go via? London. I won't go through my list, but I've got a few examples here of people who we know sail end up in Antwerp via London. But of course, what happens is many of them disembark in England and stay. And we know who they are. We know that although they take communion and attend Lutheran churches, they marry each other, secretly observe Jewish rituals, they send money back to one of the synagogues in Antwerp. And one such is the father-in-law of Rodrigo Lopez, who I talked about last week, the doctor who is accused of treason, who Shakespeare writes The Merchant of Venice in response to. So let's just look at Ruy Lopez for a minute. He's someone who is a doctor, but he's also an importer of aniseed and sumac. This area of London, you might have seen on the maps, the Leadenhall and Smithfield markets are there. Leadenhall is actually built on the site where the Roman Forum was. It's the big shopping merchant. It's the big shopping forum of the time. It's where the merchants trade. Smithfield Market, actually a street coming off at Milk Street, was where the mikveh was. We've got the remains. They're in the museum, the Jewish Museum in London. Well, the Jewish Museum no longer exists, but they're in the archive there. So Lopez was trading, but he was also a doctor. He gets involved in a power struggle between Lord Burleigh and the Earl of Essex. So the story, the salacious story is that he was treating the Earl of Essex and discovered he had syphilis. The Earl of Essex was embarrassed, so accused him of treason. But the truth is that Burleigh had a network of crypto Jews across Europe, across Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands, who worked as British spies. And the likelihood is Lopez was one of them. He is challenged by Essex, accused of plotting to poison Elizabeth, the Queen Elizabeth I, and killed. Okay, portrayed as worse than Judas. So I'm going to finish with this, okay, because I showed you last week this portrait of Lopez and I joked about it. I joked that his last line, his last words on the scaffold, was, I'm as loyal to my Queen Elizabeth as I am to my Lord Jesus Christ, or I'm as loyal as I am to Jesus Christ as I am to my Queen Elizabeth. People watching didn't believe it. The Jews thought, actually, he's not saying he's loyal to Jesus. In fact, we do know he was a hidden Jew, practiced, married a Jewish woman, Sarah. They sent money to his brother, who was part of that Antwerp synagogue community. He's definitely not, he's a converted Christian, but he's definitely keeping Jewish rituals. There's no question there. Who is the one person who does believe, if not his Christianity, his loyalty? Elizabeth. And you get it in The Merchant of Venice, and this is where I'm going to end. So, do you remember in The Merchant of Venice, there's a whole load of ring play between Portia and Bassiano and Gratiano and Nerissa? The girls dress up as, well, the women dress up as men. They become the lawyers and the advocates. They take payment by making Bassiano and Gratiano give back the rings that their women had given them. Okay. And the men give their rings away. They don't seem to understand the value of the token. There's another ring in The Merchant of Venice. The comedy, the marriage at the end, is Jessica. Jessica converts to Christianity and marries a Christian man. And in doing so, she takes Shylock's money. Oh, my daughter, my ducats. Do you remember that? But what is the thing Shylock is really concerned about? It's not that she took his money, it's that she took his ring. She took my turquoise. I had it of Leah, his wife, when I was a bachelor. I would not have given it for a wilderness of monkeys. So this is one of my arguments for a sympathy towards Shylock. The supposed merchant heroes, Bassiano, who's based on William Bond, the Christian adventurer, does not understand the value of what a ring means, not financially, but in terms of relationship and love. Shylock does. Shiloh, the thing that he most regrets his daughter taking is the wedding ring that his wife gave him. The ring his wife gave him. Shakespeare, by the way, knows it's a turquoise. This is a 16th century contemporaneous Jewish marriage ring from the British Museum. How does Shakespeare know what a Jewish wedding ring looks like? Because when Ruy Lopez is killed, is executed, Sarah Annes, daughter of a crypto Jew, Benjamin, who we know is keeping his Jewishness. He's sending money to Antwerp and he's observing the festivals. Sarah petitions Elizabeth I and says, can I keep Ruy Lopez's estate? Can I keep my husband's estate? It is the only time Elizabeth returns the estate to someone who has been murdered as a traitor to their family. She does not think Ruy Lopez was a traitor to her. But what is the one thing she keeps? She keeps the ring that was given to Ruy Lopez's daughter by the Spanish. She keeps the Jewish marriage ring, the turquoise. It's probably the ring that Shakespeare has seen. And I think it tells you such a different story about Jessica. This thing of the value of the ring represents fidelity. The ring represents trust. The Christian men don't get that. The Jews in the play do. And ultimately, that ring is the sign that Elizabeth thinks there's a bond of trust between her and Lopez. So that is my proof, looking at the contextualisation of the geography of London, that there are Jews there, particularly Lopez, who is the famous story. Does Shakespeare know him personally? We don't know. But what we do know, and what next week is going to be about, is that he knows a whole load of Venetian Jews that have arrived at the time of Henry VIII. So where do these Venetian Jews settle? Where the Portuguese and Spanish crypto Jews are, where the medieval cemetery of London is. And I'm going to finish with the article. 1997. Peter Bassano, descended from Amelia Bassano, one of the daughters of one of those Venetian Jewish immigrants, says, there's an identification with Amelia Bassano as the Dark Lady of the Shakespeare sonnets. Okay. Rouse found Amelia, daughter of one of the queens, and I'm putting here Jewish Venetian musicians, and from whose uncle Antony I'm descended, through a description of her in the diaries of the Elizabethan astrologer Simon Forman. We're going to look at him next week. Before any more academics come up with Dark Lady theories, will they take time to consider whether it's pure coincidence that Titus Andronicus has an Emilius and a Bassanio, and that Shakespeare's two Venetian plays, Othello and The Merchant, have an Emilia in one and a Bassanio in the other? So here is my little challenge to Jonathan Bate. I don't think Bassanio is just William Bond. I think Bassano is because of Emilia Bassano. And next week we're going to look at the Venetian Jews that Shakespeare knew and what that tells us about his and their writing and life. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much. We have a time for just a couple questions. I will get started. If you do have a question, please put it in the chat. I see raised hands, but we're going to put them in the chat. So go ahead and please send me a message in the chat. Okay. First question is, are there any contemporary accounts of Judaism in Shakespeare? Like, are there any contemporaries talking about what his portrayal of Judaism was, or are there any accounts of Jews of the time talking about Shakespeare?
Jews of the time talking about Shakespeare, absolutely. The Venetian musicians, but I'm saving that for next week. Just to say that someone did put in the chat a comment about someone. It was one of the slides I skipped very quickly because I had time. I didn't have time, but there was an amazing woman, Donna Gracia Mendez, who spent a year in London at this period of time, who was absolutely an observant Jew and ends up in Antwerp. I skipped it because there wasn't time, but again, she deserves a whole session of her own. So thank you, Ahuva, for mentioning that, because absolutely. And she's one of the people we get a concept of London as a place where there were practicing Jews in this period.
I will see if I can add something about her for the post-program email. Are there any indications of Jewish people working in the theater community at this time?
So mainly musicians. So what I'm going to talk about next week are the viola and the wind players. But maybe I'll give you a little kind of taste, which is, how do we know they worked in the theatre? And they specially worked, sorry, the string and the wind players, particularly the string players, we know were part of the Lord Chamberlain and later the King's Men. So you know how Shakespeare's plays are divided into acts. And by the way, the Elizabethan and Jacobean period is the first time this really happens seriously in English plays, as we get this breakdown in acts. Why in acts? Because the indoor theatres were lit by candlelight. And when the candles burnt down, the wax could drip on people's heads below. So every so often they had to trim the tapers and the candles to make sure that wouldn't happen. So they paused for an act break. Shakespeare was running a company and running the theatre, and he understood this. How did they keep people entertained between the acts? They had the musicians come in and play. So his troupe of musicians were these Jewish Venetian musicians. And by the way, they also played at court, not just for Henry VIII, but for Elizabeth I. There were masks, theatrical masks and dances at court. And it was all these Jewish musicians who were playing for those dancers. And the woman I'm going to talk about next week, Amelia Lanier, probably wrote some of them.
So it was like Commedia dell'arte type
Absolutely.
performances.
We'll get there.
Great. I have just a couple more. One is, if Queen Elizabeth knew that Rodrigo Lopez had not betrayed her, why did she not save him?
Because she was working very, very hard to publicly defend her position as the Virgin Queen. So if anyone has read anything about Elizabeth, she is a woman I mean, she's a ruthless woman. It's very interesting. When I worked at the British Library, we have the letters between Elizabeth and Mary, um, Queen of Scots. And in some ways, they are mirror images of each other. You know, they are both trapped women. Mary, Queen of Scots, is actually imprisoned, but Elizabeth I is equally imprisoned by the expectations of her. Is all this political manoeuvring, particularly there are arguments between the Earl of Leicester and the Earl of Essex. She basically gave Lopez up to the Earl of Essex to kind of it was a bargaining tool for not to have to make a marriage or for a potential affair with the Earl of Leicester to be called into question. So he was the sacrificial lamb. I mean, the truth is, by the way, there's been a very interesting book written about him. If I had time, I'd find it on my shelf. But he probably was a spy. You know, he probably was doing some trading in intelligence and secrets for the Spanish. But it's very possible he was doing that with Elizabeth and Burleigh's knowledge. So,
Interesting.
yeah.
And my last question for today is, and don't worry, there's going to be a robust post-program email, is there a media portrayal of Shakespeare that you find to be the most accurate?
Um, they're all compromised and complicated. Um, I think it's a really interesting thing because very often they're not like people are not simple, people are multifaceted, as was Shakespeare. I mean, in some ways, you know, that Blackadder type thing, the upstart crow, while it is a joke, I don't know if any of you know this. Do you know what I mean when I say Blackadder? Okay.
Like the
So there
Mr.
was a
Bean?
there was a group of British comedians who took on history. They did something, it's like a version of Horrible Histories. It's a comedy based on all the kings and queens. There is a kind of version of that, a series called Upstart Crow, which is a complete satire of Elizabethan and Jacobean England. And it's a satire of Shakespeare too. But there are some real truths in it, and actually they have Amelia Bassano in there. Um, so it's not what I would recommend for a straight portrayal. Um, what I would say is, I mean, I waver back and forth on her, but I think Hilary Mantel's series Wolf Hall, the research, that combination of fiction and research, on the England of this period is superb. If you can cope with first person writing, I sometimes find it's not great, but the research is amazing and she is a fabulous writer. I'm just not always keen on the way she represents it. And there's a fantastic fictionalized TV series of Wolf Hall. So that gives you kind of the England of this period and all the palace intrigues. Actually, I'll throw one more in. It's not Shakespeare, but there was a wonderful production a couple of years ago by the director Robert Icke of the play Mary Stuart, where at the very beginning, so they had two actresses, Juliet Stevenson and Leah Williams, and at the very beginning they tossed a coin, and depending who tossed it and whether it fell heads or tails, one would play Elizabeth and one would play Mary. And it was this
That's
real sense of
nuts.
jeopardy. And it was jeopardy for the actresses too. But the whole production was showing the echoes between them. And that more than anything else teases out Burleigh, who was Shakespeare's was Lopez's spy master. So that's a very good, if I don't know if it's been recorded or you can see it, but that's a great thing to watch.
I will look into it. I think it's very interesting that you mentioned two plays to talk about Shakespeare in a more accurate way. So I will include, if I can, links to the scripts for
I
you.
mean, Upstart Crow is a TV series. It's not
Right.
accurate,
But
it's
Wolf
satire, but
Hall,
it's fun. Oh,
right.
Wolf Hall is
But Wolf
also, yeah.
Hall
Yeah,
is
you're
also a
right.
play, which
You're
it seems
right.
like a good homage to Shakespeare to read it as a play, and
Yeah.
Mary Stuart as well. So, with that, thank you everyone for being here. We have one more session of this next week on December 2nd. So, please be there if you can. And thank you so much to our speaker.
Thank you and happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Bye.